Hi, it's Anna. Thanks for tuning in. Over the next few weeks, we're going to move through a four-part video series where I intend to shine a very precise spotlight on the label codependency. It's a label that's become wildly popular, wildly misused, and in my opinion, responsible for keeping people stunted in their healing and spiritual evolution. It's basically become a multi-decade psychological stronghold that I intend to fully challenge in this series. And just so we're clear, my intention is not to shame anyone who's ever identified or used the word codependency. It's not about, going after the personal use of the term. What I'm dissecting and challenging is the systemic entrapment of the word. Because at the end of the day, truth is precise. And when we are using labels that are imprecise, it distorts reality. And when it distorts reality, it keeps us disempowered, which goes against the very trajectory that we need to move to and that we're tasked to go on in this lifetime, which is stepping into our spiritual sovereignty. So the intention of this series is to bring back this precision and bring the conversation back into truth. You may have noticed that social media in this day and age over pathologizes everything. We've turned, normal relational pain, normal attachment, normal human complexity into diagnosis. And this trend is infantilizing adults. And the reason why I have such a problem with this is because it goes against this very trajectory that I'm talking about stepping into sovereignty. Infantilization leads to spiritual stagnation. And this video from the get-go, let's make one thing clear as well, is that it's not an invitation to step into spiritual ego or powerlessness. We're still taking full responsibility for everything, for our stuff, for our growth, for our life, for our evolution. But we're focusing on the right things, the precise things that actually evolve us and really help us evolve vertically rather than being stagnant into an illusion of growth and healing and evolution where we're actually just staying horizontal. So it's focusing on the right things that actually evolve us and that help restore sovereignty rather than collapse it. So the intention of this series is to bring back this clarity, this precision, some dignity and agency to empower you, but also to bring back some meaning and some context. The story that we've lost sight of in this age of spiritual amnesia. So this is the structure of the series that we'll be moving through over the next 4 weeks. And before we start, please note that there is a coherent story unfolding across these 4 parts. Each episode prepares you for the next, and we'll progressively move through deeper layers as we go. So I really recommend watching the episodes in order so you can get the most impact and clarity. And if this series has brought you clarity at some point, please share it with anyone who may need the same. This is how truth travels faster. So today we'll be discussing part 1, why the codependent label may be keeping you disempowered. And to begin with, I'd like to define the term and look at how it evolved over time. So when I looked at the online dictionary, codependency is commonly defined as excessive emotional or psychological reliance on a partner, typically one who requires support due to illness or addiction. And that context matters. The term was first used in the 1950s within Alcoholics Anonymous to describe family members of alcoholics. It was never intended to describe the vast majority of relationships like it is today. The concept became then mainstream in the 1980s with Melody Beattie's book Codependent No More, which expanded the term beyond addiction to include patterns of self-sacrifice, emotional over-reliance, and difficulty asserting needs. She defines it as a person who has let another's behavior affect him or her and who is obsessed with controlling that person's behavior, losing connection with their own needs and sense of self. That book sold 8 million copies and, it's now become a multi-billion-dollar self-help industry where the label is often used to describe any relationship where one person prioritizes another's need at the expense of their own. You can see it if you spend any time on social media, that it's become part of everyone's language. It's a word that we've accepted without really questioning it. And in my opinion, it's become the undisputed operating system for relational pain at this point. Like I said, without really questioning it, and this is what we're going to be dissecting today. From the get-go, I want to make some things clear. Firstly, the label codependency is actually not a clinical diagnosis. It's a label that's been widely disputed by many psychologists and experts, despite its popularity on social media. Secondly, a lot of experts actually argue, like I just did in my introduction, that a lot of normal relational pain has been over-pathologized on social media. You may have noticed that we even at a point where even kindness has been bundled into people-pleasing. It's like this conflating of terms where we put everything into one basket without really understanding the context and the nuance behind things. And lastly, not all relational pain is actually toxic or dysfunctional. Sometimes it's the exact catalyst you need for your spiritual growth. And so we're living at a time on social media where you might think that everyone has trauma. We all have been so wounded by our childhood, and any kind of relational discomfort is toxic, dysfunctional, codependent, or traumatic. It's really not the case. We don't all have trauma. We don't all have codependency. And so this is something we have to be very careful of and very discerning of when we spend time on social media, because this is where we start spending time and wasting time on things that don't actually evolve us. We actually end up wasting time on healing wounds that are not there and not addressing the root cause of the issue. And so now, because we've got this weird conflation and flattening of concepts online, it's creating an atmosphere where you might think that if it hurts, it must be toxic. If there's a conflict, something's wrong. If I feel triggered, it means I'm wounded. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Not all pain is pathological or dysfunctional or a wound to be fixed. Some pain is developmental. Some pain is a spiritual awakening. Some pain is the spiritual will awakening. Some pain is your heart being refined. And we'll go into that in a lot more details in subsequent parts of this video series. So I think it's fair to say that at this point, the label codependency has been violently stretched outside its lane, as it was originally meant for families of addiction or drug abuse. But I would argue that even in the context of drug addiction or any kind of addiction, it's still a misdiagnosis, because you have to understand that when we are talking about substance abuse, it's often become a spiritual war zone. Like, you're not just looking at just a human to human interaction. You basically have a person now who's riddled with entity attachments. And so you're observing the chaos of, trying to maintain this relationship or try to maintain some sanity. And you're slapping a label, pathologizing a very actually high instinct in that person to see a suffering soul and not want to, abandon them, to often want to protect children. Often you have this sense of loyalty. So, it's a problem when you pathologize this, because it's often actually a sane reaction to an insane environment. And that's the problem that I have with this, right? Especially in the context of, using that term when for souls who are healing from abusive relationships. Like, there's a crucial distinction that we need to make, is that very often what's labeled codependency is the end result of a systemic degradation over long periods of time. And I also think that because this label has become a catch-all for a lot of things bundled into one, it feels to me that this is a relabeling of something we used to call enmeshment, or I believe the clinical term is dependency personality disorder. which is a rare case actually of people who really lack a sense of self. They have a very low personality integration, and so they become enmeshed with someone else, and that's when the the boundaries and the sense of self line becomes blurred. So again, I'm questioning, are we relabeling things, and why are we doing that? So on that basis, I would argue that the term codependency is a half-truth that ultimately disempowers people because it pathologizes the human soul to disconnect it from its divine nature. And one thing we have to understand is that the most dangerous lies are not total falsehoods, they're half-truth. A half-truth takes a beautiful spiritual reality and twists it just enough to misdirect you. One thing I also want to do is to actually look at the etymology of the term. So if you look at the term codependent, co means together, mutual, jointly. Dependent means relying on. So the literal meaning is two people mutually depending on each other. So when you look at it this way, the word codependency, the etymology of the word, actually contradicts the popular empath-narcissist dynamic that a lot of people are talking about. In the empath-narcissist dynamic, that's actually not what's happening, right? There is no mutuality, there is no reciprocity, there is no shared dependency. It's a one-way lopsided dynamic. Like on an energetic level, it's one-directional. The narcissist requires the empath light for sustenance. They need their light, they need their emotional labor, their stability. And the empath does not actually require the narcissist for identity or emotional regulation. They are either entrapped, idealistically loyal, or psychologically destabilized. So this is not codependency, this is systemic abuse degradation, not mutual dysfunction. And that's why the term codependent is fundamentally inaccurate. So now I actually want to talk about 3 areas where I've seen this word, this label being misused and misdiagnosed. So the first one, let's dive deeper into the misuse of the term in abusive relationships. When someone is trapped in a coercive, degrading, or psychologically violent dynamic, right? Their behaviors are not signs of codependency, they are survival responses. So you're looking at someone who very often didn't start like this. They actually very often start very strong, very independent, and we'll go into that in part 2 of this video series. And over time, had to find ways to cope and to survive. And so we look at the end result, right, of hypervigilant, self-abandonment, over-functioning, or staying longer than they should. But they're not personality defects, like they're adaptive strategies. And it's due to the day-to-day, progressive, over time erosion of agency and self-love and self-worth that occurs in abusive relational fields. So often you don't start like that. It's actually a slow erosion over time, and at the end of that relationship, you're going to have to do some healing work to come back to base level, to where you started. So labeling these responses as codependent, it collapses the complexity of abuse into a personal flaw, and it places the responsibility on the very person who actually has been harmed. So it obscures the real issue, which is systemic degradation, and it misdiagnoses survival intelligence as pathology. And I've got a real problem with the trend of pathologizing strength versus exposing predators. Now let's talk about the other misuse, right? Because it can be very obvious when I talk about the misuse in the abusive context. But I've seen this label, and I've seen a lot of souls come to me having taken on this label, who are actually in misogynistic relationships, where their partner is extremely selfish and there's a complete imbalance of responsibilities in the actual environment. So I'm going to talk the example of women in these relationships because I'm talking about misogyny and it's mainly women, right? Because that's just how we've been programmed in this society, in this patriarchal society. So in these environments, women are often socialized to carry the emotional labor, to maintain the harmony, to anticipate needs, and to hold the relational field of the entire household. And not because they're codependent, but because the culture has trained them to take responsibility for the emotional climate. And when these patterns inevitably lead to exhaustion, burnout, resentment, right, the label codependent gets thrown at them as if the issue is a personal flaw rather than a systemic patriarchal dynamic in their relationship. And so what looks like overgiving or overfunctioning is often an adaptive response to a relational field that expects women to be the emotional regulators and men to be emotionally self-contained. And the reason why I have such an issue with it, right, is that when the term is misapplied here, it obscures again the real issue, the real core issue, which is imbalanced responsibility. And it places the burden of fixing the relationship on the very person who has already been carrying too much. So it's compounding an existing issue, and it's actually not clearing anything. The last context that I've seen these words thrown around so much is in the context of spiritual ascension. And again, it's a complete mislabel, and I'm going to explain why. So on the path of spiritual ascension, you're not being asked to heal a defect called codependency. You're being asked to turn inward, to prioritize your own soul evolution for a period of time so you can fortify your inner structure and deepen your connection with the higher self, right? And so there's a longing that arises, and sometimes intensely, because it's the vertical pool of consciousness rising from the personality to the soul and to spirit. So it's your soul trying to make you shift and rise in consciousness to meet it, right? And it expresses in the body as an intense longing. And the problem is often that longing gets triggered by an external relationship. And so we get confused, right? Then we assign that longing to that person. But in actual fact, the longing is internal. It's an internal process. It's not a wound. It's not a pathology called codependency. It's a summon. It's a call towards inner union, toward achieving inner union of the soul and spirit within. And that's why it's felt so physically and emotionally. It's because the entire inner architecture is reorienting upward, inward and upward. It's the soul's yearning for alignment with its own higher nature. It's the upward movement of evolution, not a symptom of neediness and not codependency. And I've got a problem with this because when people are told they're codependent, simply because they desire connection, it creates confusion and shame. Like the problem is not that you're desiring a connection with someone or that you want some love in your life. It's not at all that. And so you end up thinking that you have a psychological flaw, right, that you need to fix. And ironically, actually, by thinking that, it will pull your focus externally because you're going to think, well, if I fix my flaw, then I'm going to attract that person back. And it's not actually at all what's happening. And it's like what's happening is a very organic, important process. And it's temporary. It's not meant to last for decades. But it comes with some period of celibacy because there's a very real purification and stabilization and upgrade really of your field that's taking place. So again, like precision is key because it's not your love and it's not your desire for connection that's pathological. Like there's no problem with that. You are a human being. That's completely normal. And we have to be very careful with the words that we use when we don't really understand the esoteric mechanics of what's happening. Because it's actually responsible for keeping people confused and stuck. So we've clearly spelled out that the label codependency has been misused in various contexts. But why is this such a problem? Like, you could argue, well, why can't we just use the words that we want? It doesn't really matter, right? Well, it matters because, contrary to popular belief, words actually are not neutral. They carry meaning, history, and context. And so we have a duty to be impeccable with our words. Like I said, truth is precise, and that's for a reason. That precision is key because some words have the power to heal, uplift, and empower, and other words have the power to degrade, bind, and disempower. And that's exactly what I'm calling out in this video series. So if we look back at the original definition, right, and the context in which the word codependent came about, you can see that the label carries a low frequency. So it carries the vibration of wound, flaw, defect, pathology, self-blame, emotional incompetence, right? And so when you use words like that, that's why the word feels heavy. Like, if you actually feel it in your body, you'd be able to attune to that. It encodes shame, low self-worth, and a moral burden into a person that's already suffering. And it's often the person that's holding the entire emotional field of the relationship. So can you see how it exacerbates an existing problem? And it's actually a real problem as well, because the people who tend to resonate with that label are the ones who actually thrive on taking responsibility. All the souls that have come to me that really resonate deeply with this label, that's what we do, that we love that. We love taking responsibility for things, right? We have no issues taking responsibility or accountability for stuff. And so that's why it becomes such a binding word that keeps us looping, really, instead of evolving, is that we're already taking so much responsibility. That's actually part of the problem in the relational dynamics that we're trying to heal from. So it's asking us to take even more responsibility for something instead of doing the actual work of rebalancing that responsibility. Because what's key actually is to realize what's yours and what's not yours, and mark a very clear line in the sand. And that clear line in the sand, in a lot of cases, is that codependency is not it. It's not yours to carry. This is not what's happening. Like I said, a lot of the root cause is actually misogyny, this cultural conditioning that we're just coming out of, narcissistic and selfish partners. A lot of people are just so selfish. Like, we just have to call it for what it is. And a lot of people are actually really emotionally immature. And so instead of clearly looking at the environment and clearly assessing what's toxic in that environment and seeing people exactly as they are, seeing the dynamic exactly as it is, you're forcing people to go inward into a phantom wound that doesn't actually exist and spend so much time, years, buying all these books, going to all these retreats, going to all these seminars, trying to focus on healing this inside of you, when actually the issue is probably that you need to pay more attention, that there is people out there who will take from you until you're on your deathbed, and they won't buy an eyelid. They don't care. And you know what I've noticed with a lot of souls who come to me for guidance is that by the time they enter the healing journey, this inner work journey, these souls need to be reminded of how powerful and how beautiful they are. They don't need to be reminded that they have some low self-worth and low self-love, and they already know. They already know that. They already know there's a problem. So again, language and precision really matters. These people actually need to be uplifted and empowered, because that's the problem. The problem is the lack of power. It's a lack of discernment, and it's a lack of finally saying a holy no that doesn't just come from putting boundaries down, it comes from activating an inner fire inside of you. And that can only be done through empowerment, through empowering words. So coming back to the frequency of the words, I actually want to show you something. And I want you to practice this as an exercise to see the difference for yourself in your body. So I've outlined it in this table with the two separate terms. So first you've got codependency. Like I said, low frequency. But I actually, instead of you just taking my word for it, I want you to feel it in your body. I want you to do this exercise where you say out loud and you feel in your body at the same time. You can close your eyes if it's easier to do that. I'm having relationship issues because I'm codependent. And I want you to really attune to what's happening in your body when you say that. Do you feel the contraction? It implies I am flawed, I need to fix myself. You're probably already exhausted because you're holding so much in that relationship. So what this leads to, it pathologizes the empathetic soul and the natural capacity to love. It protects the abuser or the selfish partner, saying that it's not an environment issue, it's just all internal. It keeps you looping in self-analysis, focusing on a phantom wound. Like I said, it's basically perpetuating the cycle of taking too much responsibility for what's not yours to carry. And really, it leads to either endless looping, or sometimes it leads to hyper independence because people become so scared of their capacity to love and to be nurturing and to help people that they actually decide to close their heart. And that's just so sad. They decide to close their heart as a protection because they think that this capacity to love has been basically harmful to them. Okay, so now let's look at the other term that I've got here, which is a discernment and responsibility imbalance, which is high frequency, so it's sharp, clear, actionable, and empowering. So now you do this exercise again to attune to what's happening in your body as you say this out loud. I'm having relationship issues because I lack discernment and I'm taking too much responsibility for what's not mine. So can you feel the difference? It implies I'm carrying more than my share. It implies I need to focus on facts versus potential. I feel like this provides so much more clarity. It's shining a light on both the very real external environment issue and the internal shift that needs to happen. So like you need to actually increase your discernment as well. It focuses on the root cause and it triggers empowerment and true vertical progress. And it allows the person to keep their heart wide open. Like I said, some people make the mistake of, having to close their heart. No, your capacity to love is incredible. It's an incredible asset. And it's not something to fix. But you then shift your focus on using sharper discernment and the sword to filter access. So like I said, this power that needs to come in, this protector that needs to come in within to protect this beautiful heart of yours. So it's not the capacity to love that's the problem, it's the rose-colored glasses, and we'll dive into this into much more detail as we progress in this series. So can you see how it shifts the frequency of your healing journey? Like it lifts you out of shame or armor into awareness. It completely alters the energy you bring into the healing journey. Like we have to understand that shame is a dense, sticky, low-frequency emotion that requires a broken self to feed on. So you may not even realize that it's happening in your body, and that's why I'm asking you to do this exercise, because very often we use words and we repeat things without really understanding what's happening. When you change the diagnosis to a skill-based error, which is, a lack of discernment and taking on too much responsibility, shame has nothing left to attach to. So, the discernment failure is the input. The issue isn't that you love too much, but that, the issue is that you ignored the plain physical data the other person was presenting. And the responsibility failure is the output. Taking on more than 50% of the emotional weight in a connection is not true love. And that's what we need to come to understanding on this journey, that it's actually not true love for either parties. We also contribute to keeping other people stuck in their evolution by taking on more than that's required in the relationship. And also coming back to people who become ashamed of their big heart, right? I feel like when you use the second line, the skill error, it really neutralizes the victim dynamic, because when someone labels themselves as codependent, they're suddenly implying that they were victimized by their own capacity to love. But when you reframe that as a lack of discernment, you make it completely neutral. Like, discernment is just a muscle that needs to be built, right? It's just a lot more achievable. And there's no shame to feel about a muscle you haven't trained yet. And this reframe is actually what gives your power back. It reframes it as, your heart is beautiful and your capacity to love is your greatest asset. You just need to learn how to master discernment and responsibility. So the question is, are you taking responsibility for your healing, or are you taking responsibility for a handicap? True responsibility isn't about managing a sickness. It's about mastering your spiritual power. The codependency label, in my opinion, keeps you taking responsibility for the story instead of taking responsibility for your vibrational frequency. Like, it's a completely different mindset and a completely different process that's happening. So this concludes part 1 of this video series. We've deconstructed the codependency label, its frequency, its etymology, and ultimately its misdiagnosis. So what's the issue? Because clearly there's a problem, right? And I've touched on it a little bit with this table, but we'll be going deeper as we go into this series, because again, this is not an invitation to not take responsibility. Of course we take responsibility. There's work to do. The spiritual evolution work is very important, but it's about focusing on the right things, like I said. So next week, in part 2, we'll dive even deeper, and I'll be bringing the work of Dr. Sandra Brown and her book, Women Who Love Psychopaths, to explain why empathetic souls tend to attract emotionally exploitative partners, and to dismantle the myth that those who end up in abusive or toxic relationships are weak or come from a background of low self-worth and self-love. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and if this episode brought you clarity, please leave me a like, share, or leave me a comment. I'd love to hear what resonated with you or any personal experiences you'd like to add to the conversation.